we've got some interesting news this week about Everytown, the country's largest gun control group. They've started putting out their agenda for each state for this upcoming legislative session, right? You wrote up a story on this. Can you give us a little bit of background on it?
Yeah, that's right. So as you said, Everytown, the country's probably most prominent gun control organization. As states' legislative sessions begin for the 2022 session, they've been releasing agendas, basically what they'd like to see get passed in each state. There are some interesting ones, some that we would expect. In 5 of their releases that they've had as of recording this, they've focused on opposition to permitless carry, which we've covered the fact that permitless carry is making another push. So Indiana, Nebraska, South Carolina, Florida, Alabama,
Georgia,
basically things that Ohio, that we've covered thus far. But there were some key omissions in some unlikely states. Washington and California in particular, when they kicked off their legislative sessions, there's pretty modest proposals that Everytown was speaking out for. It was like safe storage, a bill that would mandate schools send safe storage home with students. And they didn't cover some pretty hot button issues, like Washington, for example. There's talk of reintroducing an assault weapons ban and a magazine capacity ban, and wasn't featured anywhere on the agenda. Likewise, in California, they didn't say anything about Governor Gavin Newsom's call for the Texas abortion law model to be applied to guns. So it's just interesting what they chose to support.
Yeah, I think that is really interesting. It gives you
on.
some insight into perhaps differences of opinion or differences in priorities among the gun control advocates in state houses versus Everytown, which really is the biggest player as far as gun control advocacy goes. They're funded by Michael Bloomberg in large part, but they are the biggest group. They even at points have outspent the NRA in elections. I believe in 2018 they outspent the NRA in that election. So they're very prominent. They're a very important part of this conversation, and it's how they go may mean how the legislation goes. So if they're not pushing these bills, then they're probably not going to get passed in places like California and Washington. I mean, maybe they will anyway, but it's interesting. It's almost like when the NRA doesn't support a pro-gun bill, how much push is that going to end up with? It could still pass, but depending on the dynamics in the state, and in a place like California especially, it might not matter as much whether or not Everytown is strongly backing a particular gun proposal, because they seem to kind of pass everything that comes up out there. Not everything, but a lot of the stuff. And so, but it does give you some insight into what Everytown thinks of, like, specifically the abortion strategy from Texas. Certainly there's a lot of people on the left who argue that they might not like the tactic, but that they ought to do it anyway because people on the right are doing it. And it's interesting to see Everytown not immediately jumping on board with that proposal, or at least not in the practical sense of going out and actually pushing for a bill in that vein.
Sure.
So, I don't know. It gives you some insight into strategy here down the line into what Everytown's thinking. You look at these agendas and you can see their priorities are blocking permitless carry. They're almost more on the defensive, and they're pushing more moderate positions to some degree. They're not pushing the most aggressive policies in some of these proposals. So I think it's interesting. I think it gives you certainly some feel of what the atmosphere is out there right now, even in these blue states.
Right. And I think even more telling in the California case, the Gavin Newsom proposal to copy Texas is a little bit out there as far as laws go. I know a lot of the gun groups, when he first announced that, said, well, we're reviewing it. We're not going to take a position on it just yet. But there's another bill in California, a San Francisco state legislator, Phil Ting, introduced basically a copycat bill of New York's public nuisance liability law. which differs in key ways from the abortion proposal, where it would let governments sue manufacturers and dealers for what they consider firearm violence to be a public nuisance in order to try to get around the liability protection. And they were silent on that proposal as well. Obviously that's still controversial and for pro-gun people, obviously, but it's at least been done before. And to see them stay silent on that one is also telling what their strategy might be.
It's fascinating because Everytown is not generally, afraid to push these sorts of proposals in the past. They obviously have supported assault weapons bans. They supported trying to repeal the federal liability protections for gun manufacturers and dealers. So they're certainly not shy about these sorts of policies generally. And the fact that they're not at the top of their priority lists, I think does give you some insight into the atmosphere right now. Or maybe even just Everytown's particular strategy this cycle will be to move in a more moderate direction for the policies that they want to pursue that they think are realistic to get through these various legislatures, instead of focusing on policies that are more eye-catching, perhaps, or more controversial.
Right.
So it'll be interesting to see if that keeps up and how the gun rights groups respond and how other gun control groups go about their approach. Because there hasn't been a lot of these agendas released yet from the other groups, right?
Not at the national level, at least. Some state groups have been putting out agendas for the specific states, but the national groups have largely not done anything along the lines of what Everytown's done. So we kind of right now only have
Everytown's particular strategy to go off of in terms of looking forward at how advocacy might go in these different state houses. So, but I think that's what makes it particularly worthwhile to look at what they're advancing or what they're prioritizing.